Good afternoon. This is Simon Patterson from Remuneration Associates. This is one of our regular knowledge transfer videos. On this particular occasion, we're going to talk to you about what is a non-executive director. I'm training one of the staff, junior members of our staff, and she didn't know what a non-executive director does, and it made me think I'm very familiar with it because I work with boards a lot. But it's worth knowing what a non-executive does and why. To start off with, the Cadbury report said that they should bring an independent judgment to bear on issues of strategy, performance and resources, including key appointments and standards of conduct. That is the formal role of a non-executive director. There's no legal distinction between executive and non-executive directors. There is an old joke, which is that, what is the difference between a non-executive director and a shopping trolley? And the answer is they both hold enormous amounts of food and drink, but only the shopping trolley has a mind of its own. That doesn't apply these days. The role of a non-executive director is serious, it's important, it's complex, it's increasingly paid, although it's relatively underpaid in relation sometimes to what needs to be done, and we'll talk about that. But let's just go through some of the things which a non-executive director typically does. Just to be clear about what defines a non-executive director, that is somebody who is not part of the day-to-day operations of the business. That doesn't necessarily make them independent. They can be a non-executive director and non-independent in the sense that in a, let's say, family-owned business, they may still have ties to the business which make them somewhat conflicted. A non-executive director who's independent is someone who has come in from the outside, has no, as it were, direct or indirect material relationship with the company. They have an objective and impartial judgment that can't be influenced by any sort of personal or business relationship. And that's a valuable perspective contributing to effective decision-making overall. That's a very important point for the good governance of a company and the mitigation of risk. Irrespective of whether non-executives are independent or not, they still have a vital role, and that role is really made up of 5 things: governance and oversight, risk management, performance monitoring, stakeholder management. And if we just quickly go through those, governance and oversight is ensuring that the company is operating within the law, regulatory frameworks and its own policies. And that's enormously important in terms of examples recently with car manufacturers doing things they shouldn't and the board not overseeing what they should have done. Strategic guidance, non-executives contribute directly to the development of strategy. Typically, that's a contribution. It's not the ownership of the strategy. That's something which chief executives hold dear. But that's an important element of their role. Risk management is absolutely vital, and they're legally bound, along with the executives, with the decisions that are made by the executives. They have to oversee the company's risk management framework and ensure that risks are identified, assessed, and managed. They also monitor performance, which is where we come across a lot in our role as advisors to remuneration committees in companies. Quite often, the board has a very vital role in making assessments about the performance of the chief executive and the executive team. And the non-executives are really there to monitor the company's performance against the goals that it's set. In other words, what is good performance is something which they need to decide early on, and then at the end of the day, they have to decide whether they've delivered good performance. Finally, stakeholder management. The non-executive director needs to engage with stakeholders, not just shareholders. So customers, employees, suppliers. and it's their role to make sure that those interests are being taken into account by the company. Now, there is one wrinkle to that, which is that there's a thing called a senior independent director, or a SID. And a SID is really the top dog amongst non-executives and has kind of an important role. That's a relatively new position. Well, not that new, but it's an evolution, as it were, of governance here in the UK. The senior independent director supports the chairman. He is not the chairman, but supports the chairman, and therefore sort of takes into account the views of both executive directors and non-executives in the performance evaluation of the chairman. In other words, the chairman can't mark his own homework, his or her homework. The senior independent director can do that for the chairman. And the SID leads the non-executive directors, is a very powerful voice, will relay issues and concerns upwards to the chairman, will in turn relay views from the shareholders to the chairman, and is expected to be available for meetings throughout. It's a fairly extensive and detailed job. And in addition to availability to shareholders, really is a conduit for regulatory work. When businesses are regulated, the senior independent director is a key point of contact for the regulator. And ultimately their job is to plan for the succession of the chairman over time. Chairmans don't move on that often, one would hope anyway. But when it does happen, the senior independent director would have an important role. So how much do non-executives get paid in the UK to do that job? Well, it depends on the kind of organisation. If you start from the bottom, or at least in terms of size, charity trusts, normally very little. Housing associations, between 3,000 and 20,000 per year, something like that. But pension trusts, between 20,000 and a little bit more. Investment trusts, sort of 30 to 50,000 pounds per year. For company boards, it really depends on the size of the business. So, for example, non-executive pay for AIM-listed companies is sort of between 36 and 44,000 pounds. In the FTSE 250, it's 53,000, and the FTSE 100, it could be between 100 and 300,000 pounds per year. Private company data is less available, but broadly between 3 and 50,000 pounds would be how you would pay your non-executive directors. There is an element in there depending on whether you're the chairman, whether you, because chairman gets paid more than non-executive director. If you're on a committee, you might get paid a premium. If you're a chairman of a committee, you may get paid a premium. Those amounts are roughly of the order of sort of £5,000 a year for additional roles. Is it worth it? Well, it's become tougher and tougher. There are sort of three things really to say. One is the time commitment is supposed to be 10 days a year. And I think most non-executive directors, if you ask them, feel that it's a lot more than that. To the point that the FTSE 100 companies will probably be looking at up to 3 days a week if you're the chairman of the organisation. There is a legal liability. When things go wrong, you are legally liable as a director. And there's a reputational risk, so that if things go bump in the night in the company, you as a director have your name associated with the decisions that were made. And there's no way around that. So in, for example, the United States, where non-executive directors are paid more, I'll tell you about that in a second, S&P 500 companies paid their non-executive directors 2% more last year, and it's 43% higher than it was 10 years ago. So that gives you a sense of how directors of companies view the role. They view it as something which is more onerous, more time consuming. Obviously, in America, there's more stock element of pay for directors, and some companies have done very well and they have benefited from that, but even so, it can be quite onerous. If we compare and contrast the UK with the US in terms of approach, the broad headline is that the UK views as non-executive directors as largely the police force, whereas in America they would regard them as cheerleaders. So the idea is that you're overseeing the management here in the UK, and therefore there is no conflict whatsoever between the way in which you're paid, remunerated, and what you're doing. As a result, there are never any share options granted to non-executive directors. There may be a sort of very rare grant of non-performance stock in order to attract a particularly high-profile member onto the board, but largely it's a payment in cash. Whereas in the US, one of the key tenets of director compensation is to create shareholder alignment, so that directors will act in the best interests of shareholders overall. So that's it's really very common and accomplished through stock-based awards, such as shares, share options, and restricted stock. And often that can comprise quite a significant portion of total compensation. So, for example, if I were to pick a company of a sort of AIM-listed size, between 40 to 100 million pounds of market capitalisation, the non-executive directors would be paid at the median about £33,000 last year. The chairman would be paid about £63,000. In the United States, the same sized organisation would be paid something like this. A retainer in cash of about £29,000, board fees of about £5,000, full value shares, in other words, non-performance shares, about £39,000, stock options worth about £24,000, and an additional sort of top up of committee compensation, which is an average of the amount paid to all of the non-executives for their work on specific committees, of about £5,000. That all adds up to about £104,000. So the difference, as you can see, is it's more than twice what directors are paid here in the UK. I hope that you found that useful. Just to give you a snapshot of what they are all about, how they get paid, how that compares with the United States. And I hope you have a good and useful rest of your day.